But I will tell you, when I spoke to Tessie Bond is a longtime member here, about freedom and her own personal story, I said, you need to share it. Now, Tess is a behind-the-scenes type of person, so this is wonderful to have her share. But as a professor in psychology, she's done a lot of teaching, mainly at the Florida State College of Jacksonville. But she's been involved in many things of governance, task force, religious education, ethics classes here. She's co-chairing with Marge Powell, first the Article 2's task force revision, and now the Forward Together task force. She truly is at the forefront of our principle of a democratic process. And why? Well, when she married Jerry, she said, I'm the boss. This is no democracy in this family, okay? Just kidding. But we all understand that, right? So, but Tess is married to Jerry, has 3 sons and 5 grandchildren. And believe me, democracy in families is not easy. But democracy in this country is not easy. I want to let you know she's a visionary and she's a mystic. I listened to her, and I welcome her this morning. Tessie.
I want to clarify something here. My husband is a Republican. I am a Democrat. He is a Jaguars fan. I pull from Miami. He is a Seminole. I am a Gator. So if in Washington they need someone to teach them how to compromise, we'll be glad to talk to them. Peter invited me to share the religious and spiritual journey that brought me to UUCJ and explore the connection between that spiritual journey and my commitment to protecting democratic institutions. I had never tried putting those two together. How about you? Have you ever wondered how in the world you find yourself involved in something, whatever that is? What drives you to work on behalf of a particular cause? How do strong beliefs that you may hold drive you to take a stand on some things, but not others? Since you're already here, among friends in this cozy living room, relaxing and enjoying an imaginary glass of wine or a non-alcoholic beer, I invite you to travel with me down memory lane and listen to my unfolding story. I was born in Cuba into a multi-generational patriarchal family structure, and that included my grandfather as the head of the family, my grandmother, an aunt, an uncle, my mother, my brother, and me. My dad died when I was 4. My mother never remarried. We were close-knit, as typical Latino American families tend to be, and we observed traditional family roles. The women in my family pursued careers in education, pharmacy, health-related, and the humanities. Whereas men, they pursued careers in medicine, engineering, law, finance, and economics. Both genders worked in government or private sector. Both were passionate about politics. Within a couple of months of my birth, I was baptized in a Catholic church and given the name Teresita del Niño Jesús, Little Trees of the Child Jesus. I was named after Saint Therese of Lisieux, a Carmelite Catholic mystic, patron saint of missions, and who professed deep love and respect for all peoples as the path for union with God. Besides Saint Therese, my mother revered Saint Francis of Assisi and his devotion to God's creation. She often spoke about safeguarding our earthly home as stewards of earth and all its inhabitants. As a good Catholic, I made my first communion at age 7, was confirmed at 11, confessed my sins, some of which I made up because I was only 7, went to Mass every Sunday and every holy day, attended catechism classes, and of course I ate fish on Fridays. Not once as a child did I question doctrine or the external repetitive and tedious representations of my inherited Catholic faith. Unknowingly, I was absorbing beliefs that much, much later in life would feed my desire to oppose injustice and seek a self-chosen spiritual path. It was around this time, maybe 8 or 9, that I claimed Archangel Michael as my very own patron saint. He had the sword of justice, was the angelic leader of all spiritual battles, and had the power to protect and provide security from the devil. By the way, St. Michael is recognized by Judaism, Islam, and the Baha'i faith. All was well, but then I entered a structure different from the grandeur of the basilica that was typically booming with Gregorian chant and which smelled of incense. It was the classroom, a place where I heard of things that got me into trouble. As I learned about science and physical world, biology, the scientific method, mythology, world history, the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, different forms of governments, and how the arts chronicle societal and political changes, I began questioning. I questioned religious beliefs that defied logic, the virgin birth, the Trinity, the divinity of Jesus, the conversion of wine and bread into the blood and body of Christ, the hierarchical structure of the church, and the fact that women were not allowed to be priests. I learned about different types of government systems: theocratic, monarchical, totalitarian, dictatorial, oligarchy, socialist, and my favorite, democratic. I also learned about a democratic Republican form of government that had been adopted by the founders of the United States of America after gaining independence from a king. These founders had designed a government experiment that would have, instead of a king as its leader, a president elected from the people, by the people, for the people's security and well-being. They had fought a war to place governing power in the people's hands. So I questioned Cuba's form of government because it did not appear to be too democratic. I learned that Cuba had begun to follow democratic principles after becoming independent from the United States in 1902. In the 1940s, Cubans had a constitution and had democratically elected Fulgencio Batista to a 4-year presidential term. At the end of his term, Batista ceded power to the new president. He honored the peaceful transfer of power. In 1952, however, he decided to run for a second term, even though he was told he would very likely lose. He did lose. But instead of being gracious about it and accept the will of the people, he led a military coup. Once in power, he declared himself president for life, suspended the Constitution, appointed his cronies to positions of power, jailed his opponents, and went after his adversaries. By the time I was born, my country was governed by a tyrannical despot who had no hesitation about jailing, torturing, or disappearing people. It was time when free speech was silenced, The free press was shackled, meetings of like-minded thinkers were forbidden, and redress grievances were met with dire consequences. Not acceptable to me, so at age 13, I joined Fidel Castro's revolution and linked with other teens known as freedom fighters in what is now considered to be terrorist cells. I believed in the revolution because Fidel promised a return to democracy, a constitutional form of government, and restoration of what we in the United States include in our First Amendment. The Catholic Church was in support of Castro's revolution and very, very open to justifying it because the ecclesiastical hierarchy promoted the belief that socialist economic practices and social-political governance should be linked to the Gospels, since Jesus despised oppression. In other words, secular government and religious faith should be intertwined and follow liberation theology. No separation of church and state. Unfortunately, after having believed Castro's lies and hidden intent, as well as having experienced the church's initial support for Castro, I realized that we had exchanged a tyrannical despot, one for the other. Both Batista and Castro were hungry for power, and neither cared for the well-being of the nation or the people. They just cared for themselves. As they say, same dog, different color. On June 10, 1961, my mother, brother, and I arrived in Miami with tourist visas in hand and asked for political asylum. The three of us had to leave Cuba because we were involved with facilitating the Eisenhower and CIA-authorized April 17 Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. We feared for our lives. In fact, my mother was jailed right after the invasion's failure and was out on parole awaiting trial for treason. We had just lost our country and our cultural identity. When we arrived in Miami, we each had a single suitcase weighing no more than 45 pounds. We left property, assets, money, careers, and worldly goods in communist Cuba. Left behind also were family, friends, language, security, and comfort, very likely forever. We had chosen democracy and had traded worldly goods for freedom, liberty, and self-determination. That same year, 1961, I was given a scholarship to Sacred Heart Academy for Girls in, as we say in Alabama, Cullman, Alabama. So I found myself back in the sheltering arms of my Catholic faith. My Catholic identity was intact. I fell back into the familiar and external comforts of my faith, confessing my sins, taking communion, praying the rosary, going to Mass every morning before school, participating in religious classes, and of course, eating fish on Fridays. I still value the Catholic principles and values I had learned as a child, and still wanted to be guided by Archangel Michael's sense of justice. In mid-1964, I entered the Benedictine convent in Common. I wanted to be known as Sister Michaela, but that name was taken. So I chose Sister Michelle, Order of St. Benedict. The Order of St. Benedict is a teaching order, and teaching came easily to me. The story goes that I, as a child, lined my dolls in a hallway not too far from my bedroom and taught them whatever I was learning in school. The only difference was that they did not question as I did. While at the academy and then at the convent, I learned that Benedictines belong to independent communities and oversee their own self-governance and internal affairs. They take a vow to remain in the same beloved community for life, and they democratically elect their own priors. I also learned, to my surprise, that they are engaged in the world, so they can and do pursue any career of their choice. I chose teaching. Benedictines uphold the dignity of all peoples and advocate for the care of the environment. They also value solitude, meditation, communal, individual prayers, and the pursuit of mystical experiences. My decision to become a nun made sense at the time. I became a novice in 1965 and continued my education at the Liberal Arts College for Women. At the same time, I was immersed in Catholic history, theology, and religions of the world. The fact that the convent was managed by Mother Superior, following democratic principles, dissipated my fear of jumping from democracy to theocracy. I was at peace and was on the path to healing from the Cuban exile experience. Unfortunately, before long, my earlier schooling got in the way again. I could not reconcile the fact that as an educator, I could question the physical world and apply scientific methods to discover truths. But I could not question papal infallibility, transubstantiation, original sin, the virgin birth, and in many cases, the inerrancy of the Bible. When I questioned whether I really had been called to the vocation, I was told by Mother Superior that one is faithful to the people through being faithful to God. I disagreed. I replied that one is faithful to God by being faithful to the people. I left the convent in 1966 before I made final vows. I left the Catholic Church in the 1980s. I went into a spiritual desert and began experiencing, for quite a while, the dark night of the soul, which is described by Catholic mystic St. John of the Cross as a spiritual crisis. After participating in religious wanderings, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, and a whole bunch of other isms, I heard the voices of two of my very favorite spiritual guides, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda. They led me to a church in Arlington, known as the Unitarian Universalist Church of Jacksonville. I began attending UUCJ in 1986 and joined in 1992. It seemed that everything I had been given by a faith determined to enrich my soul, my secular schooling that I had received trying to improve my mind, and the loss of my cultural identity had all conspired to fashion a new reality that offered me a spiritual option other than Catholicism, that prodded me to pursue higher education and urged me to adopt Archangel Michael's dedication to justice. I can hear the voice of the Catholic values whispering for me to embrace UU principles. Those principles have become the foundation on which my moral compass resides. Catholic teachings call me to value every person, to respect every individual's right to search for truth and meaning, to work for peace and equality, to protect the blessings of democracy, and safeguard the world from harm. I found all of the above comprehended in UUism. My inner voice reminds me why I first joined the Cuban Revolution and later the anti-Castro movement. It reminds me of what it's like to live under an autocrat who divides family and friend, who lies, who robs you of human dignity and your rights, who persecute people simply because they disagree, and who steals hope and just offers fear and dystopia. As someone who is Cuban by birth and American by choice, I revere our Constitution. In fact, I carry one in my purse. It is imperfect, our Constitution is imperfect as it was created by imperfect men and in need of persistent nudges toward fulfilling the promise of equality under the law. It nevertheless stifles autocracy. The American experiment established by our founders, at the macro level, they gave us values birthed in the Enlightenment. At the micro level, they gifted us free speech, a free press, the right to peacefully assemble, the right to seek redress from our government, and the cherry on top, the right to worship as we prefer or not at all. Our vigilance over and our commitment to the survival of our constitutional republic is critical. Contemporary Americans don't know the pain of losing a country, one's cultural identity, or one's right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. America has never been governed by an autocratic tyrant who emulates tyrannical leaders. So many of us take our government and constitution for granted and don't even vote. There is this deep complacency that subscribes to the belief that losing our democracy won't happen here because our institutions will hold. But coups happen anywhere, as we came close to finding out January the 6th, 2020. I have already lost one country and one faith, so I have no intention of going gently into the good night. I intend to, as another favorite philosopher of mine, Michelle Obama, urges us to do something. I will continue to work with local, state, and national groups to elect Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. The SEOU to make sure that not a single right enshrined in our First Amendment is touched. Americans United for separation of church and state to avoid theocracy. The Florida Women's Freedom Coalition to guarantee that every woman has the right to be the master over her own body. I care to honor my very own personal archangel's demand for wielding the sword of justice and my right to shape my own spiritual path. While thinking about writing my story, other related thoughts strained through my head. I thought about our immigration problem at the border. We do need to have safe borders as a country, and we do need an immigration system that's based on the law. At the same time, we have to remember that other than our indigenous brothers and sisters, who, by the way, also lost their countries, we are in a country of immigrants who, just like me, left or lost their country of origin and their cultural identity as they came into our shores. We can't say, I'm in, but now I'm closing the door behind me. Let's practice our first principle. Find understanding in our minds and compassion in our hearts. And Peter, when you asked me to share my religious and spiritual journey that brought me to UUCJ, and the connection between that journey and commitment to protecting democratic institutions, I thought, piece of cake. I was wrong. It took me more time than I thought it would take. Thank you for asking me to take snapshots of my life and create a flowing documentary. And thanks to all of you who sat here in this cozy living room with your glass of wine and your beer, when now very soon, you will be able to trade that wine and that beer for a real cup of coffee. Thank you and have a great day.